Mm. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, just got it underway just to make sure we don't miss anything accidentally or whatever. So I do appreciate you taking time
No problem.
for the interview. Of course, as you know, this is for the 150th anniversary of St. Peter's University. And this oral history project will be added to, I guess, an archive of other alumni as well as faculty who've been generous enough to give a little bit of time and share their history of St. Peter's. So I do appreciate you taking some time to do this.
Yeah.
I haven't introduced myself. My name is John Johnson, professor of history, assistant professor of history at St. Peter's. I've been there now for 5 years. And interestingly enough, I'm doing my research on the Weequahic section. So it's long history from, colonial Old Town to the 1970s. So
It was, I can remember, I was told the turn of the 20th century, it was largely a German neighborhood when my grandfather built a house there way back in 1910.
oh wow.
And then after the war, it became largely a Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'm telling you stuff you know. And then it became a Black community after that. So it went through lots of transitions over time.
Indeed. And another time, I would love to talk a little bit more if you wouldn't mind sparing some moments, just to recap a little bit of history, because every little narrative helps. So I would appreciate that.
Went to Burgoy Avenue School and briefly Clinton Place Junior High. I don't know if that rings any bells or not. I don't know if it exists. Burgoy Avenue School. I think it still exists. I'm not sure. And then I transferred to Catholic school, so I was at St. Peter's Chapel School, which was part of an orphanage run by orphans in the neighborhood, run by the nuns for orphans in the neighborhood. And some of us attended this little red brick schoolhouse with 8 rooms, one for each grade, St. Peter's. And then that was taken over by the city and became, I forget what, after a while. I think it wasn't the school after a while. But anyway, okay, we're getting off subject. We'll have some beers and talk about Newark.
Indeed. I appreciate that a whole lot. Just to take note, you, I guess, already filled out the consent form and everything to do the interview.
I did, and I'm seeking professional help at my own expense if any traumatic experiences come to light. That was my favorite part of that incident. I shared that with several other faculty. We had a good laugh over some Italian food one day. So anyway, yes, I did.
Trials of the IRB. I'm glad you got a chuckle out of it.
I'm sure it was just the lawyers talking. So.
Of course. So let's get things going. Dr. Gutsch, I appreciate you taking time. The time right now is 3:25. It's Tuesday, September 7th, 2021. The St. Peter's Oral History Project. I guess the first question I'll ask you is a simple one. We already talked a little bit about it, but could you describe your childhood, your family, and where you grew up before you came to St. Peter's?
Yeah, born and raised in Newark. I think there's a narrative here that was certainly true in those days, and I think is still true today. And that is, I was the first in my family to go to college, and had parents who didn't have the opportunity for an education but respected it, and guided me and encouraged me to go on and ultimately to the Ph.D. But really just it came up poor, and benefited from their love and their support for education and for me. So, and having returned, I have this interesting experience of having been a student more than a half a century ago, and more recently having been a full-time faculty member for 5 years. So it's kind of a welcome back Kata episode, if you will, and seeing the place after. I had been back many times to give talks and that sort of thing, but you live it more when you're on campus every day, and to see St. Peter's 50 years later. And I think a lot of the narrative in terms of the students in that sense is as true today as it was back then. In those days, but there have been changes, and they're good. There are changes for the better. In those days, you went to school with folks from Belleville and Nutley and Newark and Lodi, and now we have students, and you would know better than me, but dozens of countries from around the world. So it's a much more culturally, racially, internationally mixed student body and faculty, and everybody benefits from that. So that's one of several changes which I think have been for the better over the years. But the first in the family to go to college, I think rings true today as it was then. St. Peter's continues to offer that opportunity. By and large, the kids who can barely afford to do it, but will succeed as a result of it. So, great.
Do you have any siblings?
I don't. No. I'm it. A lot of my friends in this country, but also in places like Japan and Germany, do not have siblings, and it's a common reason. It's called World War II. Families were separated, and God willing, they came back together, but it was late in life, and so they had one child. A lot of my friends overseas are in the same situation. So.
Did your father fight in the war at all?
Yeah, he was in World War II, and uncles and cousins, they were from that generation that saved the world, as Don Brokaw said. That was very true. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess maybe two more questions along that same line. I guess the first one, you mentioned earlier before we started recording that you began attending a Catholic school in the week-wake section. Was that a conscious decision of your parents for you to go that route as opposed to the public school, or why Catholic school education?
Yeah, I mean, we were pretty close in the church at the time, and that was something which had always been considered. Barrow Avenue School was a block away from my house, so when I was very young, that was a little easier for everybody than me going what was probably 20 minutes and out into the neighborhood to go to Catholic school. But as I grew up, that was an easy route to take, let's say. And so I wound up going to Catholic and going on to Catholic high school and then St. Peter's. So I'm a product of the Sisters of Notre Dame, the Irish Christian Brothers, and the Jesuits. My goodness.
Through and through.
Through and through, for better or worse, yes.
Indeed. So can you tell me what brought you to St. Peter's? Why St. Peter's as opposed to college?
They offered me a scholarship. We were poor, and the fact that my education was going to be paid for as long as I kept my grades very good, and the fact that it also meant that it was close enough where I could live at home and commute in, as opposed to living on some campus someplace. And so, the honest truth is it was an economic decision, but it was one out of pretty much necessity in those days. But yeah, it was a good education. It worked out well. So went on from there to many other things. So.
Okay. What did you major in? What did you minor in?
Math and physics were my majors, and we all minored in philosophy and theology in those Jesuit education. So the course loads were hefty in those days. But yeah, I was a physics math major, and so lots of science. But then of course there was a lot of the liberal arts too, because that is the philosophy that did and continues to exist today.
Of course. Why the sciences as opposed to any other field?
I just got interested when I was young. I got interested in astronomy at the age of 7, and used to drag my telescope across the street and into an empty lot across from my house in Newark. And in those days, you could actually see the universe from Newark. And more and more lights as time went on, and we could see less and less of it over time. But yeah, it's a lot of happy memories of being in that empty lot after dark, from watching the booster rocket for Sputnik to go over in 1957 to exploring the universe from that empty lot in Newark. So.
So basically, the lack of street lights allowed for you to really take in the universe.
You could see the Milky Way from from Newark in those days. Now I live in the sticks, as we say. I live up in the woods here, and you barely can see it from here a lot of times. Light pollution, as we call it, is worse and worse, and worse and worse.
Unfortunately. Did you ever go to the Newark Museum at all when you were a kid?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I went there, took courses there, got to know the people there as professionals later in my own life. I've written and produced shows that they've presented there. So sure. That and the American Museum of Natural History, the Hayden Planetarium were, big influences, obviously, to me back in my childhood. So it was kind of fun to go back and help with projects at the Newark Museum, and it was fun to go back and be the chair of the American Museum of Natural History Hayden Planetarium for many years, and kind of paying it to the kids coming in the door then. So it's been a lot of that opportunity, and I'm very thankful for it. From running the Hayden Planetarium to teaching at St. Peter's, it's going back and reinvesting in future generations. Not everybody gets that opportunity, but I have, and I'm thankful for it.
That is a blessing. I guess it's the going full circle and being able to give back. So that's wonderful. I guess along those same lines, because right now I guess you can consider yourself a professor that some student may look up to. When you were going through your undergraduate years, was there one professor that left an indelible impression on you?
Well, several, I think. Because I was in two departments instead of one, so two names certainly come to mind, and these are folks whose names wouldn't be remembered unless you're of my age. But Father Canavan, Bob Canavan, who was the head of the math department at the time, and taught me quite a few courses, and Jim Grant, who was the chair of the physics department at the time, went on to become a dean at St. Peter's years later. So those two fellows really had major influence on me as a student. And there were certainly others. Lawrence Strickerberta, who I'm sure would never remember, but he retired shortly after I joined the faculty. But he was one of my English professors. And Dr. Collet, who attempted to teach me French. And I've just come back from probably my 20th trip to France over the years, and I haven't gotten into any trouble yet, so I guess she did a pretty good job. Been able to talk my way out of all kinds of things in France. But those folks, and lots of other happy memories as well. But those are people that, especially Jim Grant and Bob Canavan, certainly had a multi-year influence on me.
It's good to know. While you were at St. Peter's, were you engaged in any kind of extracurricular activities?
I was briefly a thespian. Emphasis on the word briefly. I found my role years later as a script writer and producer and director far better suited behind the camera, shall we say. But then again, I deal in science documentaries and that sort of thing.
Okay. Was Argos Eyes around at that time? Were you a part of that?
Argos Eyes was around. Yeah, Argos Eyes, and I'm trying to remember what we called the Powwow, I guess, which was the newspaper. And, yeah, it was mostly Argos Eyes. Minor roles, and rightly so.
Okay.
I've worked with some big Hollywood stars, but I've never aspired to be one. So I've worked with the astronauts and never aspired to be one. So.
Oh wow! What was that like? How was it to meet folks that have either traveled or orbited around Earth, even walked on the moon?
Oh, those guys. Yeah, well, they're an interesting bunch. They aren't all exactly the same, obviously, but it's a very interesting group. My boss, when I was in Washington for close to 4 years as president and CEO of an organization called the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, and they have 50 learning centers on 3 continents, and with about 400,000 students and teachers a year. And my boss at that time, who was the head of the board, was the guy who talked Neil Armstrong down onto the surface of the moon.
Wow.
And I had in my day an opportunity at least to meet John Glenn and Wally Schirra and some of the original Mercury astronauts, and had got to know Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, the first two guys to put footprints up there on the moon and whatever. So that was a fun time. But I also, you see, wrote for and directed Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. So I don't know. It's a hard thing to weigh there. You see. The real astronauts from the other guys. But I worked with a lot of the Star Trek cast members over the years. Because again, I work on science documentaries, and so we had these folks come in and do narrations and that sort of thing. The first guy I ever wrote for and directed in Hollywood was Gregory Peck, and the second guy. Yeah, see, you have to do that because you're young. And the second was Burt Lancaster, and others included James Earl Jones and Rita Moreno and a whole bunch of folks like that. Or as Gene Cornacchia once said, and I quote, "Everybody Bill ever worked with is dead." So, and I did point out that I've also written for and directed R2-D2 and C-3PO and Cookie Monster and Big Bird, and they are immortal. So,
oh wow!
I've also worked with the Muppets and worked with the Star Wars folks and all of that out at Lucasfilms. So yeah, all of that. You see, the astronauts just pale in comparison.
It doesn't count. It doesn't even weigh.
No matter how bad your day is going, you spend an hour with the Muppets, and you are a green fool by the time it's over. You're just happy. It's just that simple. So,
from Jim Henson to galaxies far and wide. Oh my goodness.
Indeed, yes.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It's amazing. Well, I'm old, so I've been able to fit it all in. So.
What impact do you think your Jesuit education had on your career and your growth in your field?
I think we talked about liberal arts education, and I think that's certainly part of it. It's seeing the bigger picture. I'm not sure you appreciate it all when you're in college. But later in life, if you have an opportunity, especially to travel the world and to see great things and to meet great people and work with great people, you come to appreciate a lot of the liberal arts education that you got, and how it complements, fleshes out a lot of the science that I wound up learning because of my particular career path. So I think that's part of it, and then part of it is is the morality part. And it sounds corny, but no, it's treat other people the way you want to be treated, and don't step on people. Compete only with yourself. Don't compete with others. You'll get someplace good. My students ask me, how do you get to travel the world, and how do you get to do this and meet these guys and direct in Hollywood, and do research in the Arctic and the jungles of Cambodia and all of that? I put on my Indiana Jones hat once in a while. And the answer is you don't cut corners. You work your backside off there. And anybody who tells you don't have to either doesn't know any better or is lying. So bloody do it. And if anybody offers you the opportunity to learn something that you don't know about, take time to smell the roses first. But once you do that very important thing, when somebody says, how'd you like to learn about, or how would you like to learn how to do, fill in the blank, say yes. Because no opportunity that was ever handed to me, I honestly believe would have been handed to me had I not done all of the things I did before that knock on the door occurred. It all was just added to it as time goes on. And it's very true today. So.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, just to give a little bit more substance to it? And so when these opportunities arose, were you 50% familiar with what you were getting yourself into? Were you 25% familiar with what you were getting yourself into? Or was it you find yourself just swimming? And I mean, what was the experience? What were those experiences like?
Yeah, well, it depended on the situation. So some things I felt, I was ready for, and other things, I taught in 4 different departments at St. Peter's. I'm one of, I think, few who were offered that opportunity. But as Gene said to me when he first brought me on, you've done all these things all over the world. We'd be crazy to stick you in one department. Pay back by, teaching the students today all the different things you've learned and done. And I was very thankful for that because it kept the job much more interesting than if it was the same courses every year. And one of the courses I used to teach was a thing called production and post-production for film and video. And this was offered through the communications department. And it's mostly junior and senior communications majors. And I would tell them the story, among many others, about that first directing job in Hollywood, where I was working with this guy that did a thing called To Kill a Mockingbird and won the Academy Award for it, named Gregory Peck. And I would give them other examples as I was teaching them all the aspects of production and post-production, from putting a film crew together to writing a treatment to pitching it to executive producers and so on. And I said, Gregory Peck is a great example of, and then the first time I ever directed a full crew on a soundstage, I was directing the droids from Star Wars at Industrial Light and Magic. And I said, this is being thrown into the deep end of the pool very quickly, and you either swim or you don't go back to Hollywood. I've been going back to Hollywood for about 38 years, so apparently with enough styrofoam I can swim. And I said, one of the things I'm hoping for you in this course I'm teaching is that when your time comes, you will not feel that the pool is quite as deep as I felt it was at those times. But yeah, it certainly depends on the situation. But those two examples certainly come to mind. And yeah, scary as hell. But I must say, they were incredibly gracious, and that was had a lot to do with me being able to get through it. People say, what was Gregory Peck like? And all that. Bigger than life. He's everything you wanted him to be. Just awfully nice person. And it's true, really, for all of the folks I've worked with in Hollywood over the years. Everybody has really been incredibly nice and supportive. That's good.
Thank you for sharing that. I think oftentimes people can look at your resume and just assume that everything was just kind of scripted and ready for you to seek forth. And I think the perspective is worth recognizing that sometimes there's a learning curve, and obviously you're able to tackle it and take care of it and do very well. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Well, coming down from, I was in Rochester, New York, at the Rochester Museum and Science Center, and I was not the guy in charge. And I went from that to being the chair of the American Museum of Natural History Hayden Planetarium in New York. And I had gone there as a kid, but that weren't the same thing. So there was another kind of deep end of the pool moment, shall we say.
Thank you for that. I guess a few more questions. It's interesting you mentioned working on Star Trek, and I can't help but think that the mission of the not of the Enterprise, but of the larger, I'm forgetting the name of the
Gene Roddenberry universe.
Eugene Roddenberry universe somehow or another has some kind of Ignatian spirituality wrapped up into it, especially the ways in which, the mission is to explore other universes and meet other people, as you said, without necessarily stepping on other folks.
Well, the prime directive, you're not allowed to muck.
Yeah.
Of course they did all the time, but you're not allowed to muck. So
Thank you. I couldn't remember prime directive. Thank you.
Prime.
Well, along those lines then, what were some of the larger societal issues during St. Peter's, or at the time when you were at St. Peter's, and what impact do you think that had both on yourself and on the community?
Well, of course, I was a student there in the mid 60s. So if you want to talk about societal issues, and you're a professor of history, so rumor has it you know about this, and you studied it and you published. I lived it, ta-da. But yeah, sure, that was a tumultuous time in which there was a lot of waking up, which sadly continues to this day. We reach points where we think, oh, well, we've learned a lot and we've accomplished a lot, and it doesn't take long before you realize, no, not really. And that was certainly the case back then, because social injustice is as much, and rightfully so, in the headlines and consciousness today as it was then. Probably more so today, because at the time back then, I think society was just, parts of society were just kind of waking up to this. What do you mean there's injustice? So certainly when you talk about the 60s, you have all of that, the racial, the ethnic, the gender-related inequalities, which continue to this day. I can remember, plucked out of lots of different memories, sitting outside the window on the second floor in McDermott Hall, with my legs hanging out of the window over what is the part of the building that comes together like this, and it's the entrance to McDermott to this day, and watching Father Victor Iannitelli, for whom the Iannitelli Rec Center is named, and another gentleman named Martin Luther King, who walked right underneath us, underneath my dangling feet, going, wow, when he had visited the campus and made an address that day. So once in a while, a little bit of the history kind of really comes through like that. So yeah, I think we lived it, but at the same time, I'm not sure we perceived it in the way that history allows us to reflect on it now. I remember my father grew up as a young man back in the 1920s, about 100 years ago. The generations in my family stretch out. My father was born before the Wright brothers flew. And I said, oh, you were a young man in the 1920s. And I said, bathtub gin, speakeasy, flapper girls, the Charleston. What was it like? And he laughed, and he said, well, it's not that those things weren't there, but that wasn't everyday life, unless you were a flapper girl, you owned a speakeasy. You worked hard, and you came home and you were tired, and you had dinner and you went to bed, and life was rough and pretty darn normal. And I think it's easier now to look back on history such as the 60s and pluck from it the headlines that remain, let's say. But on a daily basis, there was a lot of living life. And for us, quite frankly, studying very hard, because the math and the science majors that I hung out with wanted and needed, because they were the first to go to college and the families were poor, to get those jobs at IBM and Bell Telephone Labs. And I needed to go to a top university and get a Ph.D. if I wanted to do what I was going to do. And, they don't hand those things out in Cracker Jacks boxes, as we say. You really did have to knuckle down and work. And so just as my father knuckled down and worked, and my mother, in the factories of the 1920s, when child labor laws were not what they are today, we knuckled down and worked too, as a result of the goals that we wanted, but also had to face. You either did it or you weren't. You could just dream about it for the rest of your life. You weren't going to get there. So I think honestly, it was a combination.
Okay. Now I appreciate the deeper insight into that. The fact that to live through a particular period doesn't necessarily mean that you were fully engaged with it, but to bear witness to it, I think is also important. Yeah. I guess two questions around that. Is there any particular event that you were a part of, or it was really just you were buckling down and, for all intents and purposes, advancing the possibilities for your family by being successful academically? And
yeah, I think that was, my parents were very good at not, I didn't have a tiger mother, let's say. I was gently encouraged to pursue the education, but it was competing with myself and knowing that by getting the education, I would not only be able to help support them, but honor them, because this was a precious opportunity that they made very clear to me was a precious opportunity. And I didn't want to let them down. It's really that simple.
Mm.
They gave me an honorary doctorate after I'd gotten my Ph.D. at the University of Virginia at St. Peter's back in '95. My mom was still alive, and they were kind enough to bring. I had to go to Tokyo right after the speech and do some stuff over in Japan, but they were kind enough to drive my mother to the ceremony, and I got to say thank you to her. I had said thank you many times, but she used to watch me on television, so she knew I was on television. She didn't quite understand all of the things I did all over the world, but I was on television. But this was an opportunity for her to kind of sense that, he seems to be honored here, and I was part of that, and I feel good about that. I made sure she knew that she was part of that.
Indeed. Greatly appreciated. That's beautiful. Could you tell me what your parents did for a living?
Yeah. Well, again, my father they were poor. So my father had to quit school after his sophomore year in high school and go to work in the factories. My mother had to quit school in the 6th grade and go to work in the factories. So that's what life was like. My wife's, she was the first in her family to go to college. Her parents were slave laborers under the Nazis during World War II. They were Catholic, but they didn't go to the gas chamber. They were slave laborers on German farms. I think, given how much of the world we've been able to see and what we've been able to do, you never forget your roots. You never forget where you came from, and that's maybe the most important lesson in life. So there weren't no silver spoons here at all.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Wow, so much there. I guess we'll begin to wrap things up. I could ask a lot more questions. So
I can stay a little longer. I don't know what your schedule. Hey, I'm retired, so if I don't have to go to Mars, it's pretty easy with the rest of the day. But you're actually still working for a living. I mean, I do it periodically. I still direct out in Hollywood once in a while. It's just kind of fun to go out there and hobble around on sound stages and all. But I'm sorry, but
no, it's fine. I was
my time is yours.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Did you meet your wife at St. Peter's, or?
No, I met her at a Polish wedding. She was a student at Archbishop Walsh High School in Irvington, and met her at a Polish wedding. Her cousin was marrying my upstairs neighbor. Neither of us wanted to go to this wedding. Our parents forced us, and it all turned out well in spite of that. So, and it's been 52 years. So you see, I just bribed her with yet another trip to Paris. So after she had a stroke last year, I had a fractured spine, and so COVID had nothing to do with it, but we had a really lousy 2020. So once we got injections in our arms, we were itching to go to a few places. There was one other point I wanted to make, if I may. We began to talk a little bit about the opportunity I've had to experience St. Peter's down amongst it, both as a student over 50 years ago and as a faculty member more recently. And we talked about the similarity of a lot of students who are the first in their family to have the opportunity for an education. There are other changes which I hinted at, and I think a lot of them, it's a natural progression, and it's not a negative reflection on St. Peter's a half a century ago. It's a natural progression, which doesn't have to happen, but has. And that is that the faculty today are identical to the faculty 50 years ago in that they really care about the students. They honestly do. They're there to teach and to share knowledge and enthusiasm and all of those trite things, but it's absolutely true. But there are differences. More faculty these days have their doctoral degrees. More faculty not just do research, but bring their students in on their research. And we see this, in the sciences in particular, but not only do students, a very promising junior and senior upper class people, have the opportunity to work with their professors on their research, but to co-author papers in journal articles with them, and if the grant money allows, to present their research findings at international conferences. A good friend of mine, Len Chiora, who I think has been interviewed, certainly should if he hasn't been, and he has had students give papers in Nice, in Vienna, and elsewhere. What fantastic opportunities. And also travel. When I was a student, you know, a lot of us hadn't been west of the Delaware River. So this idea of going out into the world was beyond dreaming. It really was. And now students, through giving invited papers, but also through the travel study courses, which many faculty offer, including I did when I was there in conjunction with David Surrey. These students have a chance to travel the world and to see wonderful science and wonderful art through the eyes of their professors. We never dreamed of such things 50 years ago as ghetto kids. And now, so this is all wonderful to see. And also, as I suggested before, the much more diversified student body and faculty, because everybody's learning from each other as part of that rubbing of elbows on a daily basis. It's good stuff.
Indeed. Was there, when you were an undergraduate, any kind of, say, interdisciplinary work at all, or were the departments pretty much in their silos?
You've got me thinking. And of course, my experiences may not have been those of some of the other students. In my experience, yeah, you were pretty much in your silo. Now, being interested in physics, because I wanted to go into astrophysics, which I did ultimately. I'm an astrophysicist by training. So, you know, it doesn't sound like you're getting much out of the silo, but mathematics, for instance, can be taught on a purely theoretical basis, or it can be taught as applied mathematics, as tools to solve problems, be you a scientist or an engineer. And so, yeah, there was some working over the fence in that regard. Jim Grant, for instance, and Bob Cavanaugh doing that. But no, there wasn't the real out of the silos. And I must say, as frustration of mine when I was there and since, now I still serve on the Sustainability Council, is to see more interdisciplinary offerings. Something which I have really pushed for is at least a 3-credit, if not 2 3-credit core courses in global climate change. Because you want to talk about a big issue, and I tell this to my students, nothing, make a list. Terrorism, whatever you want on the list, nothing is going to impact your life more, quality of life, economics, than global climate change. And we are still painfully ignorant about it and its solutions. And what I would love to see is make up a number, 6, 8 faculty, each taking 2 weeks. I volunteered to do it gratis. I'll do 2 weeks on the climatology and the meteorology and the sciencey part of it, but bring in the sociologists, bring in the economists, bring in others, because this is the most ecumenical of subjects in terms of the impact on the world. Today, I mean, we see it. Jungles are turning into savannas, which are turning into deserts. Africa is a great example of this. And as is always the case with everything, the poor always get the short end of the stick. And we're seeing this, the growth of student soldier armies, prosecutions across the globe, fighting over resources, over food and drinkable water, and so on. We really need to understand this and tackle it much better and more knowledgeably than we have. We talked about, and I made this a point in my Michaelmas address back in 08 or so, and I said, arts and sciences, but there need to be more sciences in there, because with all due respect, it's the scientists and engineers they're going to solve these problems.
Mhm.
We all need to know art history. We all need to know literature. But to solve these problems, it's the engineers. It's, as I said to my students, be kind to the geeks, because they're the ones that are going to save your backside. And they are. But it doesn't mean that, okay, you're not a scientist. Fine. And when I say you, I'm in general,
Mhm.
people aren't scientists, but they can be scientifically literate voters in a democracy to understand bond issues, to understand this candidate versus that. Somebody who really is understanding the science, be it COVID vaccinations or global warming versus people who are just spouting dangerous nonsense. And we need to make our student body and the world far more scientifically literate. Understand, two guys in education, Postman and Weingartner, wrote some books way back when I was in grad school. And in one of them, they talked about the need for a better crap detector, as they called it. And if ever we need people with really good crap detectors, it's now. And, a third of the population of this country is in desperate need of a good crap detector. That's dangerous. All right. I'm off my soapbox.
No, stay on there if you want, please. I appreciate it. I think you raise an important question in terms of how do we, I think, whet our common interests, especially in an institution of higher education. And so if we're going to talk about climate change, I mean, I think it's important to understand the history of California or the history of the West and how the West was settled, because we just assume that you have palm trees and broad lawns out in California, but how do you transport water from one portion of the country all the way to the other? And there's this long history of Western settlement, but also significant engineering that was able to create the infrastructure that was needed to do that. We talk about
look at Lake Mead going, the infrastructure is failing because we keep building more housing developments, spreading out into the California, Arizona deserts. Exactly. Money, 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 money. Very sad. Yeah.
I think we are of common mind, I think, in the ways in which we have to kind of broach the divides between our different fields and really get at the long-term truths of what we have to do to not only address any number of societal issues, but the larger global issues. I think you're right in the sense that the climate change is the existential issue. And endemic to that, I'm a firm believer that when it comes to a lot of our social issues writ large, there's a lot of pushback against that. And that's intimately tied to pushback against issues of climate change and addressing issues of the environment, because the interests, as you noted, development and money, they undergird so much of the pushback against those movements. So
greed is unfortunately a very powerful driver and always has been. But if we don't tackle climate, we need to talk. We need to talk more and seriously. But when the water gets up to here, all you're doing is blowing bubbles. And when the water gets up to here, you're not capable of talking anymore. So,
I mean, to be totally true, I mean, to really be honestly about it, I mean, because we're in Jersey City, a coastal city for all intents and purposes, I mean, that can affect the long-term growth and development of St. Peter's. I mean, just in terms of real survival, I mean, I think that's a real question we have to look at. And especially for students that are coming from a lot of these cities, as you noted, that will be impacted by this.
Well, you look at a map of the world, and where are most of the major cities? And they're along coasts. And why? Because 150 years ago, you got goods around by ship, not by airplanes. And so people lived on the coast. But now, I used to say when I taught climatology, you're going to build a wall around, let's start making a list, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Rio de Janeiro, Hong Kong, and so on. Who's paying for that?
Yeah. And the dependency between our nations and our cities is such where we can't just kind of cut each other off, at least not immediately. We're so interdependent.
It is a global issue, and people who choose not to see that are foolishly, dangerously blind.
I think that leads us to the last question that I have. And it's one I think kind of in lockstep with what we're talking about. And it's a simple one. Why is St. Peter's University an important institution of higher learning?
I think it comes, you can look at it a lot of different ways. And certainly we have over the years, we talked about changes in faculty and the educational level of faculty and research and all of that. We can also think of it in terms of the addition of courses and departments to try to keep up with that. So I think St. Peter's has made very important efforts at kind of keeping up with the times. Not too many years ago, you didn't have courses in things like big data or deciphering code and so on. And now we have things that I, as very much a 20th century individual, barely understand. And that's fine. We've got the young who are going to carry on. But part and parcel of all of that, in terms, I think, of how you have to rate a university or a college, is the heart of the four-year experience, and or the postgraduate experience for that matter. And again, it comes down to, I think, faculty and people who honestly give a damn about the students, because it's vital, especially for a lot of students who are their first in the family to go to college and who have come out of a situation where the fostering of the humanity is a vital part of it. There are kids who can go to Big Ten universities and sit in 101 lecture halls with so many people that you can't even see the back row because clouds set in before you get to that altitude. And they'll survive. They can do it. They survive in spite of the system, not because of it. But there are a lot of kids, and I think I was one of them, that needed a much more intimate and nurturing environment among faculty who knew what they were talking about but cared. And who you could approach. And this was not a situation, as you find in Big Ten schools and elsewhere, where the faculty don't actually get to know the names of students unless they're graduate students. By the time they start being Ph.D. students, oh yes, there's Harry over there. Whereas as a freshman at Peters, you really can feel that people care and know your name and are there for you. And that is, I think, for a lot of kids, a very, very important part of the social experience, which is university. And so that transcends. I think that's one of the reasons that makes it a great place for a lot of students.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Are there any other things that you want to share, things that I may not have asked, but you want to add to the record for all of posterity?
Wow. I'm looking at my notes here. I made notes. Don't forget to talk about and that sort of thing. I've actually covered all the stuff on my piece of paper here. So I think now, mind you, at 3 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will wake up, and say, oh, I should have told him about something or other, Anne Boleyn or something. But no, I think this has been very good, and I think we've touched upon an enormous. I wish you a lot of luck editing this together at some point. This I trust will be. You're going to edit this, and it's going to be. You're going to super different aspects of conversation, have sound bites from different professors or.
Well. What we're going to do is just create a large oral history archive. And I think at a certain point, we will do the production piece. I would love to ask you if you wouldn't mind assisting with that, or at least overseeing and providing some insight. That would be great.
No, I'd be happy. I've spent a few moments in editing rooms from Hollywood to London and Tokyo, so a few in there. So yeah, no, I'd be honored to try to shovel through all of this. Yeah.
Well, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Gutsch. This has been
good luck to you.
Wonderful.
And I hope you can use some of this to help you get tenure. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty here, shall we?
Brass tacks. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I can remember at faculty lunch one day, and a biology professor who will remain unnamed was talking about voting. The presidential election was coming up at the time, and she was saying that she was going to vote for the Republican candidate. And I said, look, I feel I really have to point out a couple of things to you, as a friend. Number one, this is the Eastern liberal establishment. You're sitting in the middle of, that, right? And number two, no faculty member at St. Peter's who voted Republican ever got tenure. So there you go. Just take that.
Thank you for sharing
We're
that.
not talking about that president who left a short time ago. We can go back further into history. All right. There you. How many of these are you doing? Well, you and your assistants there.
Lauren, I think we're at 29 now. We originally wanted to just get 25, but it's grown. And so, I mean, think of it as a time capsule. We're just basically trying to capture what was going on in 2020 and 2021. So,
have you talked to Len Sciarra, who's the chair of applied sciences? He has an endowed chair. Spent a lot of years at Robert Wood. Just brilliant guy, both in terms of science, but also in terms of his knowledge of politics and economics. So if you haven't talked to Len, I would really encourage it. And David Surrey, I would think you've talked to David.
Yeah, we definitely have David.
Tells good jokes, except for his taste in country music, which is highly questionable. So there you are. Those two I would definitely recommend talking to.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay.
We'll be talking soon. Take care.
As your mother would say, go eat something.
If my kids will let me, if they let me.
All right.
Take good care.
Good chatting. Bye-bye. I don't know how to get out of this, so you're going to have to get out.
I need to stop the recording too.
Leave.